Good morning. My name is Victoria Archibald, and I feel blessed to be able to share my testimony with you today. I was born into a very loving and supportive family, and we went to church most Sundays, and I was raised traditional Catholic. And I say traditional Catholic because most of what we learned about Catholicism had been actually passed down generation to generation. And some of the most important things that were instilled in me at a very young age were the commandments and the thou shalt nots. Also, it was very important for us to go to church, but we never really understood why we went to church. This was really confusing for me. As I got older and I grew older and began to have some questions, I found myself really just walking further and further away from the church. This was really evident in the relationships that I was beginning to build in my high school years. So midway of my junior year, I started dating a gentleman, and this relationship went bad. It was very abusive, and both verbally and somewhat physically. And only through the grace of God was I able to get out of that relationship. But not before I found myself broken, feeling worthless, and ashamed. And so fast forward about a year, I had built this huge protective wall around me, and I was trying to be able to take some of that wall down brick by brick all by myself, and I was unable to. And then Paul came along. Paul was the most gentle, kind, patient man I have ever met, and still today. And through his kindness and his patience, we were able to begin to chip away at this wall that I had built to protect me. And so as our relationship began to grow and our love began to grow, we found ourselves engaged 2 years after we had met. And then about a year later, we were married. So right before we had gotten married, we got involved with a Methodist church in Fort Worth. And still again, we found ourselves going to church because it was the right thing to do. We weren't quite sure why we went, but we went ever so often. So about a year after we were married, I found myself pregnant with our first son, Auden. And I had this sense of urgency, I remember, and I began to ask myself, what do we really believe? And again, still being broken and having this protective wall still up, I was unable to answer that question by myself. So 17 months passed, and I found myself pregnant with our second son, Gabriel. And as I began to chip away on my own, it wasn't until January 2000, when I went on my walk to Emmaus, that everything began to change for me. This weekend, for the first time of my life, I felt God's pouring out of unconditional love, agape love, and I'd never experienced that before. As I explained early on, I had known God's truth through all of the thou shalt nots and the commandments, but I'd never experienced this powerful love that transformed everything for me. So this weekend on my walk, I was able to offer forgiveness to a lot of people that had hurt me, and I was even able to offer forgiveness to myself. And I received that forgiveness, and when I left, I remember feeling so light, like a ton of bricks had been lifted off my shoulders. So Paul had gone about 2 months prior to me going on his walk, and so we began to delve into our church. We became Sunday school teachers, we became youth sponsors. Those led into mission trips, both domestic and international, and we just really began to get involved, and I really loved it. And I know that one of the things that really began to change was when the valleys would come in our lives, when life would hit, we were able to look at it differently. We were able to know and trust that God had us, that our hope was in Christ, and no matter what happened, that Jesus was our hope. And so I ask you today, if you're sitting out there and you're seeking, why do you come to church? If you're asking yourself, what do I believe? I'm asking you to reach out to somebody today. I'm asking you to ask your neighbor, ask a pastor here today, because this feeling of brokenness and being lonely can be healed. I am a living example of that. My life was completely transformed because of the love of Jesus Christ. I thank you so much for letting me share this time with you today. Thank you.